Greetings and welcome back. I just listened to that last lecture and I really liked that one. So I've been complaining about some of my earlier lectures and I finally heard one that I liked. And so, as I told you last time, I really enjoy French presidential elections. I really do think they do a much better job than we do in the United States. And I want to go back to that discussion. So, when I left you in 1969, Mr. Pompidou had won the election. But just like de Gaulle, where tragedy kind of sat in the case of de Gaulle, it was kind of self-imposed. De Gaulle had a referendum rejected by the voters, and when the voters voted down his referendum, de Gaulle said, well, if the voters of France reject my referendum, they reject me. And so he resigned in protest. In the case of Mr. Pompidou, it's tragedy. Mr. Pompidou died while he was president. So once again, our good friend Mr. Poor, the Speaker of the Senate, becomes acting president until an election was called. And as your notes point out, the 1974 election was a very exciting election. There was a lot of interest. There were 13 candidates. The candidates really got the electorate excited, as you can see in your notes. There was 88% voter turnout, which is the highest in the history of the Fifth Republic. There was also the closest election in the history of the Fifth Republic. So there's a lot of things about this 1974 election that was interesting. The number of candidates was unusually high. Voter turnout was unusually high. And in this particular case, we have that situation that I talked about earlier. Remember, I told you that in the first 6 elections, whether you finished first or second was immaterial. It was basically a 50-50 shot. So once again, our good friend Mr. Mitterrand, the socialist, is back. Mr. Mitterrand wins convincingly on the first ballot. Everyone believes that he's going to win re-election. Even the French press is talking about how they think that he is going to defeat the neo-Gaullist candidate, the conservative Giscard d'Estaing, who, if you take a look at those numbers, it's 43 to 33. The socialist has 43. The neo-Gaullists, they called themselves Giscardians, who were a little bit more moderate than the Gaullists. But notice who finished third in that election. So we have a true conservative, Mr. Demas, who is a Gaullist. And Mr. Demas throws his support behind Giscard d'Estaing. And the result, as you can see on that second ballot, is a razor-thin victory for Giscard d'Estaing. He gets 50.8% of the vote. Mitterrand gets 49.2% of the vote. So a razor-thin victory. And here is the first example of what I mentioned in the last lecture, that in French presidential elections, the key happen to be these electoral alliances. Yes, it's nice to finish first, but it's even nicer if in that second round you have other political parties endorsing you, you have other political leaders who were in that first round who embrace your candidacy and support you. And here is a classic example of that. D'Estaing is way behind, 43 to 33, 10% behind. That is huge. And yet he comes through because of those electoral alliances and defeats Mr. Mitterrand, who takes a second very, very tough defeat. So Mr. Mitterrand became the leader of the Socialist Party in France in the early 1960s, and you can now see that he has been defeated twice. So now for the first time that 7-year term takes place. Giscard d'Estaing was president from 1974 until 1981. This appears to be an election where most people believed that Giscard d'Estaing was going to win. In fact, French newspapers were calling Mitterrand, quote, the most experienced loser in French history. And once again, in this election, Giscard d'Estaing is a very narrow winner in the first round. He defeats Mitterrand 28 to 26 on the first ballot, but notice who finishes third, right? Mr. Mitterrand is a socialist, and the candidate who finished third was Mr. Marchais, who represented the Communist Party, and Mr. Marchais got 15% of the vote, and Mr. Marchais and the Communists endorsed Mr. Mitterrand. And so the result in this 1981 election is that for the first time, an incumbent president loses a bid for re-election. Mr. d'Estaing is defeated on the second round, and Francois Mitterrand wins a narrow victory, 52% to 48%. And this was really a watershed in French political history, because up until the election of Francois Mitterrand in 1981, the parties of the right had won every presidential election. The parties of the right had won every legislative election in the National Assembly, and the parties of the right had won every election in electing their Senate. So for the first more than 20 years in the history of the Fifth Republic, the conservatives were the majority party. They controlled the presidency, the National Assembly, and the Senate. And so this was a victory for the left. Mr. Mitterrand and the socialists become the governing party. The socialists control the presidency and the National Assembly. And so Mr. Mitterrand is president for 7 years. He then runs for re-election in 1988. And as you can see, Mr. Mitterrand wins a significant victory, 34% to 20% over Mr. Shurok. Mr. Shurok is a conservative. He's a Gaullist candidate. He says that he's basically taking on the mantle of Charles de Gaulle. Shurok, just to give you a little background, had been kind of a flamboyant individual. Mr. Shurok was a very colorful. He was the mayor of Paris at one time. So Mitterrand defeats Shurok fairly convincingly. What is interesting was, remember, in 1986, the conservatives had won legislative elections, and so Mr. Mitterrand was forced to choose a premier of the other party. And Mr. Mitterrand did something very, very intriguing in 1986. His advisors told him that for sure the most imposing conservative politician that he was going to have to face when he ran for re-election in 2 years was going to be Mr. Shurok. So Mitterrand appointed Mr. Shurok to be his premier, to be his prime minister. Mr. Shurok thought this would get him some notoriety, but instead what happened was there was a little economic downturn in France, and Mr. Mitterrand was able to successively pin this on his premier, on Mr. Shurok, and the result was Mr. Mitterrand won a pretty convincing re-election. If you look at those figures that are in your notes, Mr. Mitterrand won 56 to 44 over Shurok in the second round. And so Mr. Mitterrand, in this particular case, became the most successful French president in history in the sense of tenure. Mr. Mitterrand served as the president of France for 14 years. late in his tenure, he was diagnosed with cancer. There was some talk early in his second term that maybe he would run for a third term, even though he was getting old. But when his health deteriorated, Mr. Mitterrand decided not to step down. Now, in 1995, we have a very intriguing election between Mr. Mitterrand's successor and an individual who had served as his premier, Mr. Jospin, and of course, Mr. Shurok. So you notice kind of a trend here developing that's a little bit different usually than the United States, although there are some parallels in American history, and I'll give you a couple of them in just a minute, right? Mr. Mitterrand lost a couple of times before he prevailed and ended up winning. Notice in 1988, Mr. Shurok failed to win the presidency, but then in the next election, he made a political comeback. And even though Mr. Shurok finished second on the first ballot, he went on to win the presidential election of 1995 over Mr. Jospin, 52.6% to 47.4%. And if you look at the candidates who finished down ballot in 1995, you kind of see why the conservatives were able to come back and win. The RPR stands for the Rally for the Republic. That was what the Gaullists had changed their name to. The Gaullists in this case were split. They ran two separate candidates, Mr. Shurok and Mr. Balladur. In this case, Mr. Shurok won. Mr. Balladur, being a good party loyalist, supported his comrade, and so that was a major thing that helped him. You will notice that there were some candidates that gave Mr. Jospin some support. For example, Mr. Hume, the communist, and Mr. Leguior, who was another leftist, the Leftist Workers' Party. Believe it or not, they're even more liberal than the communists. And so 1995 was an intriguing election. The electorate, as you can see, was very, very split. Contrast 1988, where the two major candidates got 54% of the vote on the first ballot, and you'll notice that it was 44% in 1995. So there was more support splintered on both sides. You certainly see parties of the right. The RPR is the Rally for the Republic. Mr. Le Pen, who was the leader of the National Front, which I consider, if not a fascist party, a quasi-fascist party. And you notice that there was even, for the first time, an environmental party with the Greens represented. So in 1995, we have a situation with a splintered electorate where the conservatives make a comeback. And so Mr. Shurok becomes the president of France. And then he's there for 7 years. And in the meantime, we get a change in presidential terms. 2002 is going to be a watershed election. It is going to be a very unforeseen election. Starting with 2002, French presidential terms are going to be trimmed from 7 to 5. Starting in 2002, there are now term limits being imposed for the first time. Remember, originally there were no term limits, and then starting in 2002, French presidential candidates are now limited to 2 consecutive terms. And in 2002, we have a very strange election. I call it the unforeseen election. There are 16 candidates, which is a recipe for disaster. And something happens in this election that no one, and I will admit I never saw coming, and I will talk about that in the next lecture.